It's the heart of old school training. It's the mind of cutting edge AI. Stick around to the end of the video to learn more about the BaseStrengthAI app. All right, let's cut to the part that you actually care about. This is the list of the most effective hamstring specific exercises that are going to make you not suck at deadlifting and not embarrassed to wear short shorts. You've seen all these before. They're not new, which brings us to rule number one. The key to your growth is not an esoteric list of these secret exercises that have just been kept from you up until now. Shocking, I know. The key to your growth is going to be one, figuring out if you have a deficiency, two, plugging in these appropriate exercises, and three, this is the biggie, making sure that you actually do them. See, hamstrings are like upper back, calves, forearms. Everybody wants them, but they're the first exercises that people forget about. So how do you know you have weak hamstrings? Trick question. You all have weak hamstrings. If you disagree with me, that means you're satisfied. Only losers are satisfied. But here's a few signs that your hamstrings are weak, even by your weak standards. One, you do a fuck ton of very upright squatting and not a lot of hard, strenuous, grindy hinging. This applies to CrossFitters, Olympic lifters. They have a big problem with this. Also, the very squatty power lifter build that loves to squat but hates pulling. You have kids squatting 700, 800, 900 pounds in fucking high school now. The only reason you do that feat is because you have some predisposition, which is going to make you love it because it's comfortable, and probably because you carry a lot of fat around your stomach, which aids in compression. But those two things work against deadlift. So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. You don't deadlift because it makes you feel bad, like when your dad left, and you spend all your time squatting because it makes you feel good, like when your dad was still around. Those people will say that they're not built for deadlifting, and that's bullshit. They don't like it because it's uncomfortable. Another sign is if your deadlift leaps off the ground but hits an invisible brick wall halfway up your shin or somewhere below your knee. The best way to think about the mid shin as part of the full deadlift, it's like stopping at state line on your way to Vegas. You almost never do, and if you do, it's probably because it's an emergency. All the reps you do have the bar passing through the mid shin with momentum on the bar, and it's not until you go really heavy or you're failing a rep where you feel what happens when the bar actually slows down and the hamstrings are forced to pick up slack at that point where they're the most exposed. So if that's typically where you miss, it's probably because you're not used to actually doing work in that spot, and that means that your hamstrings have to get an overhaul. Number three, if your hamstrings get debilitatingly sore on basic ass movements, it's going to interfere with the rest of your training. The key is not avoiding hamstring work, it's getting them more conditioned. So all of you people that are terrified to do a deep RDL with 95 pounds because you know it's going to cause you to walk funny for the next 5 days, that's your sign that you got to start taking this seriously. And then number four, the most important reason, if they're thin, sad, spindly strands of tissue that just look pathetic next to your big, beefy, high bar quads. I mean, if your hams just aren't big enough, the eye test never lies. It means you need to do some more work. Now, there's plenty of channels ran by guys with PE degrees that will start this discussion out with a really obnoxious deep dive into unnecessary trivia and terminology. That shit doesn't help you at all. It's just them trying to squeeze every bit of value they can out of their degree that they probably regret getting. Last I checked, people aren't pulling 900 pounds because they started programming semitendinosis days. You need to be treating the hamstrings as a group. The only exception to that is like your physical therapist when he's trying to diagnose what tendon you tore deadlifting drunk. The only thing you need to know about the hamstring is that when the knee is fixed, it opens the hip. It extends the hip to stand you upright. And when the hip is fixed, it closes the knee, it flexes the knee to bring your heel back towards your butt. This might look familiar because these are all of the movements we're going to use to target the hamstring. Now, when it's contracting, it's not actually shortening at both ends to put you into this Peter Griffin pratfall like you're having a seizure. Day-to-day stuff, when you're squatting, lunging, when the knee and hip are both moving, the hamstring is contracting at one end and lengthening at the other. Now, this is a little bit of inside baseball, but if you can extend your attention span for the next 90 seconds beyond what my 2-month-old son is capable of, you'll be a better lifter for it. Consider what happens at the bottom of a squat. The hamstring contracts, and that puts a flexion force at the knee that wants to pull your heel back. But Bromley, when we squat, the knee extends in order to stand us up. That doesn't make sense. I'm glad you noticed that. I knew you were paying attention. So how does the knee extend if the hamstrings are pulling the foot back and the quadriceps are trying to push it forward? This is called Lombard's paradox. The quadricep inserts a lot lower and it easily overpowers the hamstring at the knee joint in order to extend the knee. Now, what happens on the hamstring is it gets anchored here because it's pulling, but it ain't winning that fight. So the knee joint gets stabilized as a result. Now, as the quadricep does its thing and starts to extend the knee, slack gets taken out of the hamstring. It contracts isometrically because it's lengthening at the knee and shortening at the hip, and it cancels each other out. So it's tight, it's tense, but it's not physically shortening the way the glutes and quadriceps are during a squat. So in this way, the quadricep is actually extending the hip, because the quadricep by extension is putting that force via the hamstring onto the hip. Yeah, crazy, I know. Did that just blow your mind? But that also explains why squatting is generally a shit exercise for your hamstrings, even though it's so good for your glutes and quadriceps, because there is no real stretch shortening cycle going on. You still need strong hamstrings, but it's not going to grow them super well. Now, this is relevant to your deadlift, which is why like 80% of you are here. And repeating it in the comments is more effective at farming clout than just awkwardly forcing in the unnecessarily complex jargon that you memorized. So that should take care of the other 20% of you. At the start of a deadlift, provided that you are using a good amount of leg drive, a similar dynamic happens. The first few inches are going to occur in this same paradigm, and it's not going to be until the knee isn't moving as much, until it's relatively fixed, that the hamstring is actually able to start contracting, and that's where we get that mid-shin. So that brings us to rule number 2. If you really want to target the hamstrings, one of the joints needs to be fixed so it's actually lengthening and contracting. Now we're going to get into the surgical stuff. Good God, what am I putting together here? So this is how I conceptualize what the hamstrings are doing based on your build at different heights during the deadlift. At the very top end, it's going to be very, very heavy on glutes. The knee is fixed. The hips just have to go forward. Glutes are doing most of that. At the bottom end, there's just going to be a lot more leg drive. So you're going to look at a lot more quad engagement. As we bring the height down, 16 inches and below, I think is the productive range for training block pulls or elevated deadlifts. That is where the glutes aren't really in it yet because your knees are in the way. So the glutes can't just crank forward. Your hamstrings have to do a big job there. And the knee is a little more fixed. You're not getting as much knee travel. So I think that's going to be one of your most productive ranges. If you're used to using a lot of leg drive, just takes that leg drive away. If you go into a deficit, there's also going to be a lot more engagement just for the fact that there is more range of motion. You're having to do more stuff. The pull lasts a lot longer. So it's not as specific to the hams, but I think you will experience a bit more stress than you're used to there. Now, if you are one of these crane deadlift motherfuckers, then every inch you drop into a deficit, that just means more stretch on your hamstrings. So the most tension is just going to be at the deepest deficit. Now, you're probably not going to be jumping to this if you do pull like this, because your hamstrings probably aren't weak, because every rep you do on a deadlift is like all hamstrings, and just increasing the stress more in addition to regular deadlifts might be a little bit of overkill. Might be a good variation for you to prioritize for a period of time, but that depends on you. But I think it's important to know how these changes play in. Now let's start getting into the nitty gritty of these lists. We're going to start with the big boys, the hinging movements. These are easier to program in than just more deadlift variations, but they're still heavy hitters. There's going to be a lot of systemic fatigue. They're less surgical. That's everything that has to do with extending at the hip, because usually you're working through your midsection, your erectors, your upper back. Those muscles have to work, and of course your glutes work. So these movements, easier, higher frequency, of course, really good growth stimulus, but they pack a punch. So let's put this guy together in an RDL position. Jesus, starting to look like human centipede. So don't get caught up in the difference between RDLs and stiff leg deadlifts. Stiff leg deadlift is just pushing your knees back, putting your ass up in the air and doing a deadlift. So less technical consideration. The back might round. You're going to go to the ground in between each rep. An RDL specifically is technical. Back stays tight. It's a hinge. A hinge is executed as an RDL and vice versa. That means the spine is rigid. You're just moving at the hip. Knee is soft but stays fixed. And usually you're floating the weight. You're not going all the way to the ground. If you can get to the ground, you're bendy, stand on a box, so you float that weight. Now, I like both of those things. One, because it practices a good habit of being bent over with a rigid posture under a load, which is great for strengthening the muscles of your upper back, midsection, abdominals. And that's not a problem that lifters have, doing too much of that work. Usually lifters are quick to say, oh, I don't have to worry about keeping my back straight. Okay. So that's thing one. Thing two is that it also makes the movement harder, more stress on the hams in a way that causes the weight to be lighter. So there's not as much systemic beatdown, which is a reason you can do RDLs repeatedly throughout the week for higher reps, for more sets. So you can get a lot more work in without it chewing you up. When you're trying to technically pick apart other complex movements and you're talking about a hinge, the RDL is what they relate it to. Nobody ever said a good morning is like a stiff leg deadlift with a bar on your back. It's a hinge. It's an RDL with a bar on your back. And that carries over to a lot of other athletic movements. Now, The knee's fixed, so the hamstring stretches and contracts. Also notice this nasty moment arm. Gravity's pulling you straight down, so you measure the horizontal distance between the joint that's moving and where the load is or the center of mass is, and it's the length of your torso. So at the bottom, when the muscle is stretched, that's where the moment arm is the greatest. That is how you determine if a movement is really, really good for hypertrophy. Stretched, but also it's hardest at the stretch position. That's huge. Now, if this is comfortable, you can make it harder. You can target them more by increasing the stretch with the deficit. If this is hard, this is torture. You can also incorporate more time under tension on the way up or on the way down. The hamstring's exposed here, so more time you spend exposed. Again, it's not all just blind force production and motor unit recruitment. The more time you have the hamstring exposed where it's vulnerable, where it has to do all the work, the more it's going to adapt. And another trick here is to limit the lockout. As you come all the way up, again, the glutes take over at the very top, so you can do some bodybuilding shenanigans, keep tension on the hamstrings by getting through that deep stretch, coming about 3/4 of the way up. I like doing 1.5 reps. I know lengthened partials are a thing now. 21s are another thing I've done in the past. It's really cool. You get a shit ton of blood flow in the hams. You'll feel them in a way that you didn't know they could be felt. If you didn't know where they were, you will after you do that. You can pause at the stretch. You can pause mid-rep. There's a lot of ways to church it up. You got to pick one. You're not going to be able to do all these at once. These are all just options you have that will get a greater stimulus per repetition. Single leg is another one because when you use two legs, you have two very strong muscles that are fighting against your midsection. Now you can bully your hamstring. If you have the entirety of your torso working against one leg, you can force a deeper stretch. Your midsection, your upper back isn't going to be the weak links. That's a really easy way to lower the systemic stress and increase the stress on your hamstring if you're having trouble recovering throughout the week. Now, another one I like is to focus on the reach. Remember, we pointed out the moment arm. If you reduce the moment arm by pushing the weight back, that cues your lats to squeeze in a way that they're not used to. So you get a lot of upper back stimulus. That's a good deadlift specific maneuver because that's something you need to do on a conventional deadlift to keep the bar from drifting. So that's a good cue for that. But also it's a little less stress on your midsection. If your lower back bugs you, that'll take it out of your lower back and you'll notice it's easier to feel your hamstrings stretch. So that's like a trap bar, a cambered bar where the weight's allowed to come back, or you can just be really good at pushing the barbell right back against your shins. And you're going to notice it's going to feel easier to put it in your hamstrings. Now, if you do the opposite, if you reach, you increase the moment arm, your hamstrings have to work a fuck ton harder. You're not going to be using nearly as much weight. There is going to be more stress on your upper back. We're going to get into like safety bar and camber bar. Good Mornings Next does this exact same thing. But these are both variations you can do. They just have trade-offs. If your upper back is usually the weak link, I don't recommend you reach unless you're trying to work that. If you're doing that for your hamstrings and your midsection or upper back's a weak link, this is going to make it harder for your hamstrings to get focused on because it just makes that weak link harder for you. Moral of the story, everybody should be doing their damn RDLs. Now, the question to float or not to float, you can do RDLs both ways. Typically, they're floated. Now, the thing is, all deadlifts already go from the ground. So why would you just want to continue doing that? Usually it's because it's easier, it's more comfortable. If you're used to doing that and you incorporate a float, that's going to be a nice welcome change. I think it's harder on the hams to float because at the most stretched position, they're having to do more work under more control, but it is also harder on the torso to float. And for some of you, that might take away your ability to focus on the hams. I like constant tension if I am trying to isolate a group, not through all of my heavy lifts, but if I am focused on pinpointing one group, constant tension by not relaxing, not resting, floating does that. And then I feel it more. That's obviously very subjective. You can do it from a pause, but I bias strongly to floating. I do the same thing with bent rows. Everybody loves Pendlay rows for a reason. It's easier, it's more comfortable. I tend to think floating is a better developmental stress per repetition. That's just me. Again, it always depends on what you're conditioned to, where you're strong, where you're weak, and so on. So you got to use your brain. Now, as we take this exact position, change where the bar is, change the arm position, and now we're in a good morning. Same rules apply for a good morning as an RDL. Now, you're not going to stretch too much. If your back's parallel, that's probably more than enough. And many of you are going to have trouble consistently doing that. Also notice that the bar's fixed. Your arms aren't going to be drifting back. So you're immediately going to feel that fixed long moment arm. Makes it a lot harder on your posterior chain and on your hamstrings. You can do the same thing by moving slowly, feeling purchase in the middle with time under tension, and you can also limit lockout. Now, I recommend doing that because of the nature of the movement with lighter weights. If you're just trying to get a pump and get some blood flow in, with heavier good mornings, take a breath at the top, reset, because your midsection is going to be vulnerable. It's harder to chip off reps like that. Now, advantage or disadvantage bars, instead of moving the bar forward or back with your hands, you can use a safety bar or a cambered bar that does the same thing. Same rules apply. Camber bar is easier on the midsection. I like it because it saves my lower back and I can feel the stretch and I can really work the shit out of them. Safety bar is great for working the upper back or midsection. So much so that I think it really does take something away from your hamstrings, unless your upper back and midsection, the muscles around your torso, are very strong for you. Again, it's up to you. Pins are also a good option. People whiff on good mornings a lot because they don't feel secure. Putting pins, super easy workaround. Come down, tap evenly, reverse. Don't bounce. In fact, I actually recommend a pause if you are using pins. You're not floating, sure, but going from a pause and then starting from a dead stop takes away stretch reflex, so it makes it harder from that end. And as you get better braking, especially in a deeper stretch from the pins, you'll notice that your horsepower at the start of your deadlifts just absolutely skyrockets. And that consistency is really important. That's why most people don't do good mornings, is because they feel weird at the bottom and it's hard to commit to that drive. Pins can help you get a feel for that. But as soon as you get comfortable, I recommend rotating them out, at least occasionally. Getting a really strong reversal of direction from a floated position in a good morning, that's just a sign that every part of your extension is going to be really strong. So I think that's important to strive for. Now we take the same position, turn you over again, and put you on a back extension machine. In fact, we're specifically using the FreakAthlete Nordic Hyper, the Swiss Army knife of gym equipment. This is the best thing for the home gym to hit these muscle groups. There's nothing else that's going to let you do as many of these movements. You have a barbell, maybe some specialty bars. This fills in all the gaps. Now, the big thing with back extensions is whether or not you're doing 45 degree or 90. They both are going to work your hams, absolutely. But again, looking at moment arms, looking at how the leverages are. At the bottom, you got a good stretch. That's good. Knees fixed, hamstring is stretched because you're flopped over. If gravity is pulling straight down, the moment arm is going to be the horizontal distance between your hip and the center of mass, or we can just look at where the weight is. Now notice on a 90-degree back extension at the bottom, this is like your bicep at the bottom of a curl. Like, yeah, it's stretch, yeah, it's under a load, but the way the muscles are contracting, it's putting this horizontal force. Now, if you're moving horizontally, but the weight's going down, that means technically no work is being done per unit of contraction. Now, as you arc up, now that direction, that vector, is going directly against gravity. So where the moment arm is the greatest, that's where you're working directly against gravity. So the top, very, very difficult on the hamstrings and the glutes and everything on this movement. Very, very easy at the bottom, where you should be having the greatest developmental stress. So this is really good for glute development. Glutes have to really hit hard at the top. Erectors come into it quite a bit too, because you're so focused on trying to get those last few inches. People end up arching back. You get a big back bump on this. Usually it's harder to keep a true brace. This is why the 45-degree back extension was created, because at the bottom position, at the stretch position, you are moving directly against gravity, or at least close to directly against gravity, and there's more of a moment arm. So they are more challenged at the stretch position. Again, that's how you get a really, really good growth stress. And you notice that the hamstrings are challenged through the entire range, all the way up to lockout. So it's not just glutes. So 45 degrees, take the win. 90 degrees, they're still good. They're not useless. But if your hammies are weak, 45 degree, I think, is where it's at. Now, one of the easiest ways to load it up is to take a barbell. Pete Rubish was huge with this. He'd do a barbell and he would do a deadlift. Now, the thing is, your hammies are so disadvantaged here because there's nothing else where your knees are locked and fixed against an actual implement. And then this moment arm is so huge because, again, you're not standing upright where the weight's really close to you. The weight's pitched way out in front. So you get this moment arm through the entire thing. Now, the thing is, this is more of a limited range of motion if you're using a barbell, but you can overload the shit out of it. So it's a trade-off. That's very good, very specific to deadlift strength. You can really focus on max force production. I would not do this unless you have a lot of experience working on your hams, because in this disadvantaged position to start slinging weight, you want a wide base of base work. You want to have done a lot of deep stretches, a lot of high reps. You want to have some growth there to begin with. So I recommend you start with something that's easier to scale and represents less systemic stress. It's going to interfere with the rest of your training. And that's really just holding the weight out in front of you. And the reason is it doesn't take a lot of weight. It's easy on your midsection and upper back, but a 10-pound plate, a 25-pound plate held out in front, that increase in moment arm puts so much more stress on the hamstrings. Just so easy to do. And then once again, all the other rules apply. Stretching further, focusing on the stretch at the bottom, I think is great. Moving slower through a tempo, pausing at various positions. At 1.5 reps, again, I like limiting lockout on these as well. Worsening leverages by holding the weight out in front, increasing them by using a barbell and just going heavy as shit. So those are the bread and butter hip extension movements. Now we get into the flexion movement. This is what everybody already does, but people don't take them seriously. I think people feel, they intuit, like, yeah, I worked my hamstrings, but they don't really sell out on it. It's one of those movements hard to get really excited about. Lying hamstring curls or seated hamstring curls. It's the same basic movement. The difference is in a seated hamstring curl, your hip is flexed, it's shortened. So the hamstring is lengthened right there. In a lying hamstring curl, it's open, so it's contracted. So you get more fuller contraction at the top of a lying hamstring curl. You get more fuller stretch. You get a nasty stretch at the bottom of a seated hamstring curl. It's one of the reasons people tend to bias towards this, because you really can't understate the importance of that stretch. It is huge, especially if you're not used to it. And the great thing, now we're in territory where we don't give a shit about your torso. Your midsection, upper back doesn't have to do a damn thing except hang out and read a magazine. So you can really go all in on this. So really loading up that stretch, that's something most people haven't experienced. And when you do commit to it, you're going to get a lot of quick, nasty growth. And it's painful, especially, again, you start utilizing these other principles if you spend more time at the stretch. Pump reps, 1.5 reps. If you're holding the stretch at the bottom, because so much of the growth stimulus is in the stretch position, that you're really justified in driving through 3, 4, 5, 6 partials at the end of a set after you failed. There's a lot you can do with that. Also, you'll notice if you do drop sets, supersets, rest pause, if you take short rest periods, focusing on the stretch, hanging out, and then getting that pump, so much blood gets driven in the hamstrings, you're going to feel them like you've never felt before. I'm a big fan of these. Now, the secret twist I like for this stuff is single leg. That's how you take something like this that's not specific and make it more specific to your strength in your deadlifting, because, again, all of your effort, all of your neural drive on getting one leg to execute, it's so much easier to move weight and to pull that hammy as hard as you absolutely can. Where both legs a little weird, a little unstable. So I do like to focus on single legs. Sometimes I'll do these twice a week. One day is 2 leg for high reps. Another day is 1 leg and I'll go heavier. So you get some variability there. But single leg hamstring curls, really great way to build strength in the hamstrings. The other reason this is cool, you don't really get this with hip extensions. I mean, sometimes they'll have like machine back extensions, but those aren't very common. And I don't think there's a lot of people that live and die by them where they do pop up. But when we go with the hamstring curl, we're operating off of this cam-based machine, which smooths out this strength curve. So remember with free weights, how much of the muscle contraction as that lever arm arcs is working directly against the load. That changes as you go through the movement. That's not the case with machines, because you're always pushing in the direct opposite position of where the load, of where the resistance is. What that means is lengthened, midpoint, full contraction, you are getting a similar amount of resistance. So the strength curve is smoothed out. And that's one of the main reasons machines were invented, was to deal with that, because with free weight movements, you're always really strong in one spot, really weak in the other. Machines fix that. So just another reason to really take this stuff seriously. It can add quite a bit to your training. Now, the last one, we're going to cover Nordics. And this is a big selling point of the FreakAthlete Nordic Hyper. There's a lot of Nordic benches out there, but this one does so many different things, it's not even funny. This is just a hamstring curl in reverse. It's just an inverted hamstring curl. Now, the reason it's different is because of the leverage. Instead of you curling a specific weight, you are curling essentially your entire body. I mean, just look at the moment arm here. It's so big. You have the entire mass of your body pushed so far away from this small little knee joint. So it is prohibitively difficult. It's a huge barrier to being able to do this. It's one of the biggest problems of it. It's a great movement. By the time you can do it, you know you have damn strong hamstrings, but it goes from being really easy at the top to really difficult at the bottom. So much so that it's even hard to rig up with bands to find the right amount of resistance. It's either stupidly easy or way too hard. Now, one of the reasons the FreakAthlete bench is so good is because you can put it at different inclines. So you're in the exact same position, but you're making it incrementally easier as you start higher up. So it's easier to scale and you can just progress the angle down, down, down until it's more difficult. And if you're a pro at it, you can actually go into a deficit and make it really effing difficult. Now, I'm a big fan of glute ham raises as kind of an intermediary. Glute ham raises are much easier to scale, same basic movements. I don't do the full thing where you're going into like a back raise and then coming up into the reverse curl. I like to focus on the reverse curl. It's easier to rig up bands, to have some assistance. Those are much more scalable. You'll see a lot of people do eccentrics, then push themselves back up. The eccentric is a good way to temper yourself to the weight, to kind of get one foot in the door. I actually prefer it though, if you can focus on the full range of motion with just an appropriately scaled amount of weight. I do think that's actually better. Now to finish off, some people might be asking about an actual reverse hyper. I think those are great for the lower back. I've used them in the past. The reason they don't tend to work the hamstrings so well, even though they've been billed as a hamstring exercise, it's because where you're moving isn't fixed against the rigid part of your leg and hip. Your spine is hanging off the end. So in order to get that hip extension, the erectors have to do a shit ton of work in order to come up at the top and get that full extension. So people exploit the momentum, which there's no way around it. You kind of have to, but also that action is huge, huge, huge on the erectors. And that causes it to be such a good developmental movement. But that's also why it takes precedent over the hamstrings. The hamstrings don't end up really being targeted the same way. You might get a glute pump. You're definitely going to get an erector pump. But again, you want joint fixed. You want less noise, less movement when you're trying to target the hams. So I've used reverse hyper quite a bit. I haven't really noticed a lot in my hammies. However, each one of these that we've gone over will be brutally effective. So we're going to jump right into it. We're going to talk about the new project. I'm very excited to bring you BaseStrengthAI. No matter what program you do, eventually progress is going to stall. That balance of stress and recovery is going to get a little wonky. And the only way you keep going is if you personalize it to yourself. So as far as the application, BaseStrengthAI, it's not generative AI. It's not, hey, ChatGPT, write me a program. This is all fine-tuned, exhaustive decision-making that we set based on the information you put in. So to start, there's a huge questionnaire, everything from your lifting style, your perceived weaknesses, your tolerance to work, your training history, all of these things get factored into trying to set a good starting point for you. That is put against a backdrop of my templates. Now, I think my app is unique in that I have 3 to choose from, where the others, there's just kind of a default, like this is how we program. The ones we have are Bull Mastiff, 70s Powerlifter, probably 2 of the most popular ones, and then Block is a new one. It is a very long, I think 24-week block periodization structure. They all differ substantially based on how much barbell work there is, the set and rep scheme, and the method of periodization. So I started out thinking this is a cool gadget for people that are just highly serious and want the ultimate edge on their training, or for people that just like trying new shit, that try every new app when it comes out, or for people that just wanted to offload their decision-making completely onto somebody else. All valid reasons to try this out. But as time went on, I started to see this more as something that inevitably had to be the replacement for remote coaching. All of the things that are important moment to moment are things that are usually outside of the control of a remote coach. This cuts that out at the knees, because every time you plug in information, you're getting direct feedback. Like, nope, this is what you're doing now. This didn't go as planned. This is plan B. Oh, this went really well. You're sandbagging it. Kick it up a notch. So all of that is taken from the beginning through each workout, through each week, through each block for as long as you run the programs. And again, that makes every single program you run viable to you. And look, if you're not a guy that's sauced out of his mind or have all the elite genetics, this is the type of stuff that you want to tighten up. So hopefully this will help people the way I really truly think that it will. So if any of that sounds interesting, go to basestrength.com, try it out. There's a free trial. Again, so much gratitude. Really happy to be part of this cutting edge tech. The tagline is the heart of old school training, the mind of cutting edge AI. Do you like that tagline? I'm really fucking proud of that tagline. I came up with that at like 4 a.m. when I was screwing with the website on like Sunday, the night before it was supposed to launch. It's not just that it's catchy, it's that I really think that encapsulates how I feel about this. I wanted to use technology, science in a way that was actionable, in a way that actually provided something tangible that could directly make your training better. But I also wanted to preserve what I thought was the bare bones, the soul, the heart of what training is. And that is good movements done with a lot of effort, consistently, for a lot of work, driven forward over time. Like just being on a warpath, I need to grow like it's my job. That heart is baked into these programs. That's what you're going to experience if you run through it. And you're going to know, flat out, no bones about it, am I running this program the way Bromley wanted me to? So hit the link. Thanks again. Till next time. This is Bromley. I'll see ya.